The first spoonful stopped the whole table. The ranch hands had been talking over one another, boots still dusty from a long day under the blazing western sun, but the rich smell rising from the stew silenced every voice. It tasted like something from another time, the kind of meal that could warm a man after riding through cold winds or sleeping beneath an open sky. The old rancher lowered his spoon, looked around the table, and asked the only question that mattered. "Who made the stew?" Nobody answered right away. The cook, who usually worked in the ranch kitchen, had gone into town before sunrise. None of the hands claimed it. A few men simply shrugged and kept eating, too hungry to worry about where such a fine meal had come from. But the rancher was not a man who ignored small mysteries. Years of working the land had taught him that every unexpected thing had a story hiding behind it. Outside, the cattle settled into the evening while the last light faded across the rolling fields. The wooden fences stretched toward the distant hills, and the wind carried the smell of fresh hay through the yard. Near the old barn, someone stood quietly with folded hands, watching the house from a distance. The figure stayed in the shadows, careful not to be noticed. The ranch had seen hard seasons before. Drought had tested every family for miles. Storms had torn down barns that took years to build. Folks who lived out here understood that neighbors survived by helping one another when times turned rough. Even so, strangers rarely appeared without bringing questions along with them. When one of the younger hands stepped outside to fetch more firewood, he caught sight of the lone figure near the fence. It was a tired young woman wearing a faded dress and carrying a small cloth bundle that looked far too light to hold much of anything. She looked hungry, worn from travel, and ready to disappear the moment someone spoke to her. The rancher walked onto the porch and called out with a steady voice, asking if she had been the one who cooked the meal. She hesitated before giving the smallest nod. Then, with eyes that carried more sadness than fear, she admitted she had nowhere left to go. Before anyone could decide what should happen next, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the quiet valley, and every face turned toward the dark road leading to the ranch. Every conversation on the porch came to an end as the riders drew closer. The sound of hooves rolled across the dry ground until 3 horses stopped outside the front gate. The men sitting at the supper table exchanged uneasy looks. Visitors after dark were uncommon, and unexpected ones usually carried news that could change a family's future. The rancher rested one hand on the porch rail and watched without saying a word. The young woman lowered her eyes and tightened her grip on the small cloth bundle. She did not try to run. She did not step forward either. She simply stood where she was, as though she had reached the end of a road that offered no more choices. The riders remained near the gate instead of coming into the yard. Their faces were hard to make out in the fading light, but they seemed to be searching for someone. One of the ranch hands quietly whispered that they had passed through the county a few days earlier, asking questions at farms and trading posts. Nobody knew much about them, only that they never stayed in one place for long. The rancher glanced back at the young woman. "Did you know they were coming?" She answered with a slow shake of her head, but her worried expression suggested she recognized the sound of those horses long before anyone else had noticed them. Before another question could be asked, the oldest rider called out with a calm voice, asking whether anyone had seen a traveler carrying a small bundle. His words sounded polite enough, yet something about them left the yard feeling colder than the evening air. The rancher had spent his whole life reading people. He trusted honest eyes more than smooth words. The frightened look on the young woman's face reminded him of families who had lost everything during harsh winters and long droughts. It was the look of someone carrying more burdens than belongings. One of the ranch hands quietly leaned toward the rancher. "She cooked for us before asking for a thing. That ought to count for something." The rancher gave a slight nod but kept his attention on the gate. He had learned that kindness and caution often had to walk together on the frontier. As silence settled over the ranch, the young woman finally spoke. She admitted she had worked in kitchens from one small town to another after losing the only family she had left. She never stayed anywhere for long because trouble always seemed to find her, even when she had done nothing wrong. The riders waited without moving, and the rancher realized the answers he needed were still missing. Whatever story the young woman carried had only begun, and the people waiting beyond the gate seemed determined to become part of it. The rancher stepped off the porch and walked toward the gate with the slow confidence of a man who had settled more than one disagreement in his lifetime. He stopped several feet away from the riders and greeted them without inviting them onto the property. Out on the open range, respect was important, but so were boundaries. The oldest rider tipped his hat and repeated his question. He said they were looking for a young woman traveling alone. According to him, she had left without saying where she was headed. His words sounded reasonable, yet they carried just enough care to make them feel rehearsed. The rancher asked a simple question in return. "Is she in trouble, or are you bringing trouble to her?" For a brief moment, none of the riders answered. Back on the porch, the ranch hands pretended to busy themselves with clearing the supper table, but every ear remained fixed on the conversation. One of the older hands quietly remembered seeing the young woman arrive before sunrise. She had asked only for water. When she noticed vegetables, dried herbs, and a little beef waiting in the kitchen, she had offered to cook breakfast in exchange for a few hours of work. Nobody had expected the meal to remind them of home. The young woman watched the exchange from the porch steps. Her hands trembled slightly, though she tried to hide it. She knew that one wrong answer could send her back onto the lonely roads with nothing except the small bundle she carried. Inside that bundle was an old recipe book with worn pages and a faded blue ribbon tied around it. It was not valuable to most people, but to her it held every memory she had left. The recipes belonged to the woman who had raised her, teaching her that a warm meal could earn trust where words often failed. One of the younger ranch hands noticed the book when the cloth shifted. He wondered why someone would protect a cookbook as carefully as gold. The riders exchanged quiet glances before the oldest one finally spoke again. He claimed they only wanted to ask the young woman a few questions. Still, he avoided saying exactly where they had come from, or why they had searched through several towns to find her. That missing piece bothered the rancher more than anything else. A cool wind swept across the ranch, carrying dust over the yard. The cattle grew restless near the fence, and even the ranch horses lifted their heads as if they sensed something unusual. The rancher looked back toward the porch. The young woman met his eyes for only a second before looking away. In that silent moment, he realized she was hiding more than fear, and whatever secret rested inside that worn bundle was beginning to pull everyone at the ranch into the same dangerous mystery. The rancher took one slow step back toward the porch without taking his eyes off the riders. His years on the frontier had taught him that people often revealed more through silence than through speech. The three men looked patient, but they also looked determined. They had ridden too many miles to leave without answers. The young woman stood quietly beside the porch railing. She looked at the old recipe book in her hands as though it carried the last piece of the life she had once known. The faded pages were stained with years of careful use. Between them rested small notes written in a gentle hand, each one sharing simple advice about cooking, family, and never turning away a hungry traveler. The rancher noticed her fingers resting on one folded piece of paper tucked deep inside the book. "What is in there?" he asked softly. She hesitated before answering. "It is the only thing I have never shown anyone." Before she could explain further, one of the riders spoke up from the gate. His voice grew firmer than before. "We believe she is carrying something that belongs to another family." The words drifted across the quiet yard, leaving everyone uncertain about what to believe. One of the ranch hands frowned. He had watched the young woman spend hours helping around the ranch without asking for payment. She had mended torn kitchen towels, cleaned dishes, and even shared the little bread she carried with the ranch dog waiting by the steps. Nothing about her actions matched the picture painted by the strangers. The rancher slowly turned back toward her. "You have heard what they said," he told her. "Now it is your turn." Her eyes filled with emotion, but she remained steady. "The book was given to me," she replied. "I never took it from anyone." She carefully opened the cover and removed the folded paper hidden inside. The edges had turned yellow with age. A small ribbon kept it neatly folded, as though someone had expected it to be read only when the right day arrived. Even from several steps away, the rancher could see that it was not a recipe. The oldest rider leaned forward in his saddle the moment he saw the paper. For the first time since arriving, surprise crossed his face. The evening breeze lifted the corner of the letter before the young woman quickly held it down. Every person in the yard waited for her to unfold it. The ranch hands stopped moving. Even the horses stood unusually still. The rancher had the feeling that whatever was written on that single sheet would decide not only the young woman's future, but also whether the strangers had come seeking the truth or had misunderstood it from the very beginning. With careful hands, the young woman unfolded the old letter. The paper was worn, but the writing remained clear. She looked at the rancher before reading it aloud. It was written by the woman who had raised her, explaining that the recipe book had been a gift, freely passed on with the hope that its pages would continue bringing comfort to families wherever life might lead. The letter also asked anyone who found the book to judge its keeper by kindness rather than by rumors. Silence settled across the ranch. The oldest rider slowly removed his hat. His expression changed as he listened to every word. When the letter was finished, he let out a long breath. "We were told a different story," he admitted. "We believed the book had disappeared after its owner passed on. We never knew she had chosen to give it away." The tension that had filled the yard began to fade. The ranch hands looked at one another with quiet relief. The mystery that had followed the young woman from town to town had been built on mistaken assumptions instead of truth. The rancher stepped closer and handed the letter back to her. "You kept this safe all this time?" he said. "That tells me enough." The riders exchanged a few quiet words among themselves before offering a sincere apology. They had spent weeks following uncertain stories, hoping to settle a question that had traveled farther than the truth itself. Before leaving, the oldest rider wished her well and admitted that the journey had taught them not to believe every tale carried from one town to the next. As the sound of their horses faded into the distance, peace returned to the ranch. The next morning, the smell of fresh stew once again drifted from the kitchen. This time, everyone knew exactly who had prepared it. The ranch hands gathered around the table with grateful smiles, and laughter filled the room instead of worry. The old rancher tasted the first spoonful and smiled. "I hope you plan on staying," he said. The young woman looked through the window at the wide fields, the weathered barn, and the people who had stood beside her when they barely knew her. For the first time in many seasons, she felt that the road was no longer calling her away. She accepted his offer to remain at the ranch, helping with meals, tending the garden, and becoming part of a place that slowly became home. Travelers passing through soon spoke about the welcoming ranch with the unforgettable stew, the kind rancher, and the young cook whose simple recipes brought strangers together like family. Sometimes the greatest gift is not finding a destination. It is finding people who choose to believe in you before they know your whole story. On that old American ranch, one warm meal opened a door that changed every life gathered around the table, proving that kindness has a way of leading lost hearts home.